The ghost arrived with the tide of static, whispering through the recycled air of Elias Thorne's workshop. They weren't spirits, not in the old world sense, but fragmented data streams. The last digital shrieks of the Callisto settlement before the shards had scoured it clean. He sat in the dark, the glow of a single console painting his face in hues of blue and corrupted red, his fingers tracing patterns on the cold metal desk. The audio filters he designed could barely untangle the cacophony, but sometimes, if he focused, if he let the grief hollow him out just right, he could hear them. He could hear his daughter's laughter, a 3-second loop from a birthday message buried beneath the screech of fracturing rock and the low, resonant hum of an entire world being unmade. That hum was the only sound the enemy ever made, a planetary death rattle that vibrated in the bones and lingered in the mind long after the light of the colony's star had been snuffed out. The shards didn't conquer. They consumed. They were a crystalline plague, moving through the black in silent, geometric perfection. Their ships like cathedral spires of obsidian and quartz that drank light and bled silence. They would land on a world, burrow deep into its crust, and sing it to pieces, absorbing the minerals, the metals, the very essence of the planet, until nothing remained but a cloud of sterile dust and the faint, echoing cries of its data ghosts. Elias had spent the last 2 years collecting those ghosts, not just from Callisto, but from a dozen other dead zones. He was a scrapper, but he didn't salvage metal or tech. He salvaged endings. He sifted through the wreckage of humanity's broken frontier, hunting for the pieces of the enemy's song, convinced that if you could understand how something died, you could learn how to kill its murderer. A sharp, metallic rap on his workshop door shattered the seance. "Thorne, the quarry master wants to see you. Now." The voice belonged to Commander Eva Rostova, a woman carved from the same asteroid granite as their hidden sanctuary. The quarry was the last significant bastion of humanity, a hollowed-out rock drilled deep into the Kuiper Belt, home to 50,000 souls who had learned to live without sunlight and hope. Rostova was its warden, its shield, and its unforgiving will. Elias killed the feed, the ghost of his daughter's laugh vanishing into the quiet hum of the life support. He stood, his joints cracking in protest. He was too young to feel this old, his face a roadmap of sleepless nights and a grief so profound it had become a part of his physiology. He ran a hand through his graying hair and followed Rostova's rigid silhouette down the rough-hewn corridors of the asteroid. The air tasted of ozone and recycled water, the walls lit by bare, functional light strips that cast long, dancing shadows. They walked in silence, a familiar and contentious quiet that had defined their relationship for years. She saw him as a brilliant but dangerously obsessed asset, a man whose personal vendetta might one day prove useful. He saw her as the embodiment of their slow, managed extinction, a commander who fought for survival when he knew, with every fiber of his being, that the only thing left to fight for was revenge. The command center was a vast cavern at the heart of the asteroid, its far wall a thick pane of reinforced quartz looking out into the abyss. Below, the dockyard swarmed with activity, drones and maintenance crews crawling over the handful of ships that constituted their fleet. At the center of the room, a holographic map glowed, depicting the encroaching territory of the shards as a blood-red stain spreading through the outer systems. Rostova gestured toward the map, her expression grim. Intel just came in from a deep-range probe. It found something. On the map, a single point of light pulsed deep within the red stain. We're calling it a resonator node. We think it's a command and control structure, a nexus point that harmonizes the shard fleet in this sector. They don't have leaders, but they have conductors. This is one of them. She zoomed in, revealing a system of dead planets, their orbital paths littered with the fine gray dust of their own demise. At its heart was a protoplanet, a massive, half-formed sphere of rock and ice. And on it, the probe's scans showed a crystalline structure the size of a mountain, pulsing with an energy that warped the space around it. Brute force won't work. Rostova continued, her gaze shifting to Elias. We've thrown everything we have at their smaller ships and barely scratched them, and a full-scale assault on a world they've fortified is suicide. She paused, letting the weight of the statement settle in the cold air. But you've been working on something else. Not a bomb. Something specific. She led him to a shielded bay adjacent to the command center. There, on a reinforced pedestal, sat his life's work. It was ugly, a chaotic sphere of scavenged parts, human wiring crudely fused with the iridescent, razor-sharp fragments of shard technology he'd collected from dead worlds, wires snaked from its core like metallic entrails, feeding into a containment field that shimmered with barely controlled power. It was called the Dissonance Engine, and it was vengeance given form. It wasn't designed to explode, it was designed to sing. Elias had spent years analyzing the resonant frequencies of the shards, the planetary hum that preceded their consumption of a world. He discovered that their crystalline consciousness, their hive mind, existed as a perfect, harmonious chord. His engine was designed to broadcast a single, perfect note of anti-resonance, a frequency so fundamentally wrong, so anathema to their nature, that it would theoretically shatter their crystalline structures from the inside out, turning their perfect harmony into a cascade of screaming, uncontrollable noise. "It's never been tested," Elias said, his voice a low rasp. "The power required to generate a stable waveform could tear this entire asteroid apart. It needs a dedicated reactor and a direct line of sight." Rostova nodded, unsurprised. "You'll have both. We're giving you the stiletto." She pointed toward the viewport, at the smallest, sleekest ship in the dock. It was a prototype stealth courier, an experimental vessel with a hull that could mimic the radiation signature of empty space. It was a ghost ship, designed to slip through blockades, not fight battles. It was also their only asset that had a prayer of getting close enough to the resonator node without being detected. "The ship has a two-man crew," Rostova explained. "Your pilot is Griggs. He's the best we have at flying quiet. Your systems engineer is Kenji Tanaka. He's young, but he understands reactor dynamics better than anyone in the quarry. He'll keep the engine from blowing you all to hell before you get a chance to fire it." The names meant nothing to Elias. They were just more variables in an equation that was supposed to end with a mountain of shattered crystal and, if he was lucky, his own oblivion. He walked closer to the engine, placing a hand on the humming containment field. He could feel the wrongness of it, the psychic friction between the human and alien components warring within. He had poured all his hatred, all his loss, into this machine. It was a suicide bomb that targeted the enemy's very soul. "It's a one-way trip," Elias stated, not as a question, but as a fact. He looked at Rostova, his eyes burning with an intensity that made even the stoic commander flinch. "You know that, right? The energy backlash from a successful detonation at that range will vaporize the stiletto. There's no escape vector." Rostova's jaw tightened. "The mission is to deploy the weapon and neutralize the node. Your survival is a secondary objective. We're losing this war. Thorn, the shards are adapting. They're moving faster. The node in the Hades system is coordinating their push toward the belt. If we don't stop them there, the quarry is next. This isn't about vengeance anymore. This is about buying the human race a few more years to hide in the dark. But for Elias, it had never been about anything else. He looked past her, toward the glowing red stain on the map, and saw only the ghost of Callisto. He would silence the enemy's song, even if it meant his own ended with it. He met his crew in the sterile briefing room an hour before launch. Griggs was a wiry man with tired eyes and hands that were permanently stained with grease. He looked at Elias with a mixture of professional respect and deep-seated cynicism, the look of a man who had flown too many hopeless missions to believe in miracles. Kenji, on the other hand, was barely out of his teens, his face clean, his eyes wide with a terrifying combination of awe and raw fear. He looked at the dissonance engine schematics like they were holy texts, and at Elias like he was some kind of vengeful prophet. The kid still thought this was an adventure. "So, you're the ghost hunter," Griggs said, his voice gravelly. "I ferry the cargo, you aim the gun, and the kid here makes sure it doesn't melt through the floor. Simple enough." Kenji swallowed hard, nodding vigorously. "It's an honor, sir. Your work on resonant cascade theory is legendary. To weaponize it, it's a paradigm shift." Elias ignored the praise. He spread a schematic of the resonator node across the table. "This is our target. According to the probe's deep scans, the central crystalline formation acts as a focusing lens. The energy signature is weakest at the polar axis. That's our entry point. You, Griggs, will get us within 500 kilometers without so much as a whisper. You, Kenji, will divert the ship's primary reactor into the engine's core capacitor. The transfer needs to be seamless, or the power spike will light us up like a nova." He looked from one to the other, his gaze cold and absolute. "I will handle the firing sequence. The engine has to be tuned to the node's precise resonant frequency in real time. Any deviation, and we might as well be throwing rocks at it. There will be no mistakes. There will be no second chances." As they walked toward the stiletto, the klaxon for departure echoed through the corridors, a mournful, lonely sound. The ship was little more than a cockpit, an engine room, and a cargo bay where the dissonance engine was now bolted to the floor, humming its dissonant tune. It felt less like a warship and more like a coffin. Kenji strapped himself into the engineer's station, his hands flying across the console with a nervous energy that made Elias uneasy. Griggs, however, was calm, his movements economical as he ran through the pre-flight checklist. He was a man at peace with his own mortality. Before sealing the hatch, Elias paused and looked back at the main viewport of the quarry. He saw Rostova standing there, a small, solitary figure watching them go. Theirs was a silent pact. She was giving him his weapon, his ship, his chance at vengeance. And in return, he would become the monster she needed to save her world. He wouldn't fail. He couldn't. He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, he let himself hear it one last time, the 3-second loop of his daughter's laugh, a sound he would carry with him into the heart of the enemy's silence. The stiletto's engines engaged with a low thrum, pulling away from the asteroid with practiced grace. Griggs guided them out of the relative safety of their harbor and into the endless, star-dusted black. The countdown clock on the main console began ticking. 72 hours until they reached the Hades system. 72 hours until he gave the ghosts their due. The ship slipped into stealth mode, its silhouette dissolving into the void, becoming just another shadow in the graveyard of space. The silence that followed was absolute, a profound and heavy quiet that felt like a prelude to the end of the world. The first 24 hours were a masterclass in silence. The stiletto moved like a phantom, its hull absorbing radar pings and spitting back the cold, empty signature of interstellar dust. Inside, the silence was of a different sort, thicker, more personal. It was the quiet of three men sharing a space no larger than a cargo hauler's cabin, each walled off by the gravity of their purpose. Griggs was a fixture at the pilot's console, a statue of worn-out vigilance. His movements were minimal, his eyes constantly scanning the void ahead, not for what he could see, but for the subtle gravitational distortions and radiation whispers that betrayed the presence of a shard vessel. He drank bitter, recycled coffee and said nothing. Kenji, meanwhile, was a storm of contained energy. He flitted between his engineering station and the cargo bay, his datapad a permanent extension of his hand. He was in constant communion with the dissonance engine, monitoring its energy fluctuations, charting the slow, deliberate process of charging its core capacitor from the ship's reactor. Machine was a hungry god, and Kenji was its nervous acolyte, terrified of its power but mesmerized by its design. He would often stare at the chaotic sphere of alien and human tech, muttering calculations to himself, his youthful fascination a stark counterpoint to the weapon's grim purpose. He tried, on several occasions, to draw Elias into conversation, to discuss the elegant brutality of the engine's theoretical waveform collapse, but Elias offered him nothing. Thorne had walled himself off in the cramped aft section of the cockpit, rounded by a nest of makeshift consoles jury-rigged into the ship's primary sensor suite. He was not flying, not engineering. He was listening. With a set of custom-made acoustic dampeners over his ears, he was once again sifting through the static of dead worlds, his face illuminated by the scrolling, corrupted data of humanity's final moments. He was hunting for the precise frequency of the Hades node, the keynote in the symphony of destruction. The first disturbance came 30 hours into the journey. As they were navigating the Oort cloud of a star system the shards had consumed a decade prior. It was no longer a system, just a graveyard. The planets were gone. The star was a dim, dying cinder, and the space between was choked with a fine, gray powder that glittered in the starlight. The pulverized remains of worlds. Griggs slowed the stiletto to a crawl. "We're flying through ghosts," he murmured, his first words in almost a day. The dust was so fine it was almost intangible, but the ship's sensors registered it as a faint, persistent haze that could compromise their stealth sheath if it grew too thick. Suddenly, a proximity alert chimed, soft and insistent. "Contact," Griggs said, his voice flat, "big one." On the main screen, a representation of their reality appeared their small ship, a tiny blue dot, and a wave of deep red sweeping toward them. It was a shard harvester, a vessel so large it had its own gravitational field, moving through the dust cloud like a whale through krill, filtering the very essence of the dead system. "Kill the reactor," Griggs commanded, his hands already dancing across the controls. Full silent running. "Kenji, decouple the engine's charge cycle. Now." Kenji's face went pale, but he complied instantly, his fingers a blur. The low hum of the stiletto's systems died, plunging the cabin into an eerie, profound quiet, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the frantic beat of their hearts. The only light came from the red warning icons on the console. They were adrift, a dead piece of metal in a cosmic tomb. Through the forward viewport, they saw it. It wasn't a ship so much as a moving landscape, a mountain of obsidian and quartz that blotted out the stars. It was impossibly vast, its crystalline facets shifting and rearranging themselves with a slow, organic grace. It paid them no mind, its passage as inexorable and unthinking as a force of nature. As it drew closer, a low vibration began to resonate through the stiletto's hull. a deep, subvocal hum that seemed to bypass their ears and settle deep within their bones. It was the shard song, the sound of consumption, of planetary digestion. Kenji squeezed his eyes shut, his hands clamped over his ears in a futile gesture. The sound was inside him, a pressure building behind his eyes. Griggs remained motionless, his knuckles white where he gripped the helm, his gaze fixed on the monstrous shape passing them by. But Elias leaned forward, his eyes wide. He had ripped the dampeners from his head, and a look of terrible, rapturous understanding crossed his face. He wasn't hearing noise, he was hearing information. The hum was complex, layered, a chord made of 1,000 different notes. He could feel it in his teeth, in his soul. It was the sound that had torn Callisto apart. It was the sound that had swallowed his daughter's laughter. And here it was, pure and unfiltered, a gift from the abyss. The harvester passed, its hum fading slowly, leaving behind a silence that felt even deeper, more profound than before. It took a full 10 minutes before Griggs felt it was safe to bring the systems back online. The low thrum of the life support returning was the most beautiful sound Kenji had ever heard. He was trembling, a sheen of cold sweat on his forehead. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice shaky. "That was the enemy," Griggs said. His tone clipped. "Get back to work. Couple the charge cycle." But Elias was already working. His fingers flew across his console, inputting new data, rewriting the firing algorithms for the dissonance engine. "It's not one frequency," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. "It's a harmony, a living chord. The node isn't a conductor, it's a tuning fork. It keeps the entire choir in key." He looked up, and for the first time, his eyes seemed to focus on the other two men in the ship, seeing them not as components of the mission, but as witnesses. The probe data was incomplete. The sound they make isn't just a byproduct of their process. It is the process. They don't break worlds apart with drills or explosives. They sing them apart. They find the resonant frequency of a planet's core and amplify it until it shatters itself from the inside out. A sick realization dawned on Kenji's face. "My God," he breathed. "The engine. You're not just planning to shatter the node. You're planning to steal their song and sing it back at them. Completely out of tune." Elias gave a thin, chilling smile. It was the first time either of them had seen him do so, and it was more terrifying than his anger. "A choir only works when everyone is singing from the same page," he said. "I'm going to give them a new note, the one that comes at the end of all things." The incident with the harvester changed the dynamic on the ship. The shared proximity to death had forged a fragile, unspoken bond. Griggs, seeing the raw, terrifying genius of Elias's work firsthand, developed a grudging respect that went beyond his duty as a pilot. He still saw the mission as a suicide run, but now he began to believe it might actually work. Kenji's hero worship, however, began to curdle into a deep, primal fear. He understood the science, the elegant, beautiful math behind the engine, but now he understood the cost. He saw the cold, burning void in Elias's eyes and realized that the man was not just building a weapon, he was composing a hymn of hate, and they were all just instruments in his orchestra. Kenji started having nightmares. He would dream of the hum and of the vibration, but in his dreams, it wasn't a planet shattering, it was his own bones, his own skull, resonating until he dissolved into a cloud of fine, gray dust. He would wake up gasping for air, the phantom vibration still rattling his teeth. He threw himself into his work with a feverish desperation, focusing on the numbers, The power conduits, the reactor stability, anything to keep his mind off the terrible music they were about to make. Elias, for his part, became more energized, more focused. The encounter with the harvester had given him the final piece of the puzzle. He spent the remaining hours of the journey in a state of intense, almost ecstatic creation, his hands a blur as he refined the engine's core programming. He no longer needed the data ghosts of the dead colonies. He had the enemy's own voice to work with now. He was shaping the anti-resonance, honing it, giving it a razor's edge. It would not just be a dissonant note, it would be a psychic scream, a wave of pure conceptual wrongness aimed at the heart of their collective consciousness. With 12 hours left on the clock, Griggs spoke up from the helm. "Thorn, I need to know something." Elias looked up from his work, annoyed at the interruption. "When you fire that thing, what happens to us?" Elias's expression didn't change. "The resonant cascade will propagate instantaneously. The node will shatter. The resulting energy release will create a feedback loop that will overwhelm the engine's containment field. The stiletto and everything within a 1,000-kilometer radius will be subjected to a simultaneous structural and biological waveform collapse." Griggs stared at him, his face impassive. "Put it in English, you magnificent bastard." Elias paused, then gave the clearest explanation he could. The music stops, and then we stop. Griggs nodded slowly, a dark understanding in his eyes. He looked out at the stars, a faint, melancholic smile on his lips. "Good to know," he said, and turned back to his controls. He had lost his own family on a failed Outer Rim colony, not to the shards, but to a simple, stupid cascade failure in a life support system. He wasn't driven by vengeance like Elias, but by a profound and weary exhaustion. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was just tired of running. This mission, this final, glorious act of defiance, was the best death a man like him could hope for. It was a good day to stop running. Finally, the proximity alarm chimed again, this time with the coded signal they were expecting. "We're at the edge of the Hades system," Griggs announced, his voice a low growl. "Stealth systems are green, going to passive sensors only." On the screen, the first telemetry began to trickle in, painting a picture of their destination. The system was dead, just as the probe had reported. 6 planets, all of them scoured down to the bedrock, their orbits clean of even the finest dust. The shards were tidy eaters, and in the center, orbiting the dead star, was the protoplanet. Kenji brought the deep-range scans online, focusing on the energy signature Rostova had shown them, but the image that slowly resolved on the screen was not what they expected. The probe had only seen one node, one massive structure, when the probe had been looking from a vast distance. Now that they were here, the stiletto's more sensitive instruments revealed the truth. There wasn't just one resonator node. The entire protoplanet was covered in them. Hundreds of crystalline spires, ranging from the size of skyscrapers to the mountain they had anticipated, all pulsing in perfect, synchronized harmony. And swarming between them, like hornets guarding a nest, were thousands of shard vessels. The probe hadn't found a listening post. It had found their capital, their hive. Rostova was wrong, Kenji whispered, his voice trembling as the tactical display populated with an impossible number of red icons. This isn't a command node. This is their home. Elias stared at the screen, at the nest of cosmic horrors that had been allowed to fester in the dark. A slow, terrible smile spread across his face. "Good," he said, his voice filled with the quiet reverence of a man standing before the altar of his one true God. "She didn't send us to kill a conductor. She sent us to shatter the whole damn choir. The revelation hung in the cockpit, thick and suffocating. A single resonator node had been a suicide mission. A planetary hive of them was a sentence to be erased from existence. Kenji felt the blood drain from his face, his carefully constructed composure shattering like spun glass. He saw the tactical display not as data, but as a writhing mass of certain death. "We can't do this," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Sir." The engine was calibrated for a single target, the energy cascade. It can't possibly generate a waveform powerful enough to affect an entire planet's worth of them. We'll fire it. They'll barely feel it, and then they'll swarm us. It's pointless. His panic was a palpable thing, a frantic energy that threatened to overwhelm the disciplined confines of the ship. Griggs, however, remained unnervingly calm. He took a long, slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving the forward view. Kid's got a point. Thorn. The plan just went from impossible to certifiably insane. You got another trick up your sleeve. Or do we just pick the biggest one and hope it makes a pretty light show before they turn us into space dust? His pragmatism was a cold anchor in Kenji's rising tide of fear. Elias turned from the tactical display, his eyes burning with an almost feral light. The discovery of the hive hadn't instilled fear in him. It had filled him with a terrible, clarifying purpose. It was as if fate had delivered not just the murderer to his doorstep, but the entire bloodline. "The plan doesn't change," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to mimic the very enemy they faced. "It expands." He strode over to Kenji's station, pushing the trembling engineer aside. His fingers moved with a surgeon's precision across the console, pulling up the core schematics of the dissonance engine and overlaying them with the real-time energy readings from the shard hive. "You're thinking in terms of brute force. Kenji, you want to shout louder than them, but you don't silence a choir by screaming. You do it by introducing a note that makes it impossible for them to hold the harmony." He pointed to the screen, where hundreds of energy signatures pulsed in a perfect synchronal rhythm. "Look, they aren't just individual structures, they're a circuit, a planetary-scale resonant circuit. They're all connected, feeding off each other, amplifying each other's song. They think it's their greatest strength." He tapped a single, smaller spire on the periphery of the hive, one no larger than the others, but positioned in a way that made it a crucial junction in the energy flow. But a circuit has a weakness. You don't need to blow up the power plant if you can overload a single critical fuse. He began to recalibrate the engine, his movement swift and certain. He wasn't increasing the power output, he was narrowing the focus, refining the dissonant frequency into something infinitely more complex and insidious. He was no longer building a bomb. He was crafting a virus, a mimetic virus made of sound. "The new plan is this," Elias announced, his back still to them. "We don't target the big one. We target the system. I'm encoding the dissonant frequency with a self-propagating harmonic. When we fire it into that junction node, it won't just shatter it. The cascade will inject our song into their circuit. Each collapsing spire will become a new broadcaster for our frequency, passing the dissonance along to the next, and the next. It will create a chain reaction. We're going to turn their own network, their own harmony, into the weapon of their extinction. We're going to teach them how to sing themselves to death." The sheer, audacious horror of the idea silenced them both. Kenji stared, his mind struggling to process the theoretical leap. It was monstrous, brilliant, and utterly terrifying. Griggs let out a low whistle. "You're not a ghost hunter, Thorn," he said, a note of genuine awe in his voice. "You're a goddamn necromancer. You want to raise their own dead against them." He looked at the swirling mass of red on his screen. a new light in his tired eyes. The odds were still 0, but the quality of the ending had just improved dramatically. All right, Necromancer, I'll get you to your fuse, but it's going to be a rough ride. Their passive sensors are layered like an onion. Getting this close means we'll have to fly through their inner patrol routes. It's not about being quiet anymore. It's about being invisible. He began plotting a new course, a suicidal corkscrew trajectory that would take them diving through the densest swarms of shard vessels. He was no longer just a pilot, he was a surgeon, preparing to guide a scalpel through a living, hostile organism to a single vital nerve. The stiletto banked, its stealth system straining as it began its descent into the mouth of hell. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of tension. It wasn't just the fear of death, it was the sacred, terrible anticipation of apocalypse. Elias worked with a feverish intensity, his mind and the machine becoming one. He was no longer just operating the engine, he was communing with it. His own grief and rage the fuel for the mimetic code he was writing. He poured the memory of his daughter's laugh, twisted into a sound of pure agony, into the wave form. He took the digital screams of Callisto's dead and wove them into the harmonic structure. The dissonance engine was no longer just a machine. It was a reliquary of human pain, weaponized and aimed at the heart of the things that had caused it. They slipped past the first patrol wave undetected, 3 cathedral-sized ships that moved with a silent, deadly grace. Griggs held the stiletto in the shadow of a piece of orbital debris, a chunk of a shattered moon, using its mass to mask their approach. The proximity hum returned, a low, persistent thrum that vibrated in their chests. Kenji, despite his fear, found himself hypnotized by the sight. Through the viewport, he could see the crystalline hive in all its terrible glory. The spires glowed with a soft, internal light, pulsing in unison like the bioluminescence of some deep ocean leviathan. It was beautiful, in a way that defied all human aesthetics. It was the beauty of perfect, unfeeling order, of a life form that had transcended the chaos of biology and become pure, living mathematics, and they were here to smash it to pieces. Second wave incoming. Griggs' voice cut through the awe. They're tighter this time. They know something is here. Can't feel us, but they can feel the hole where we are. I'm going to have to make a burn. It'll be quick. Kenji, be ready to vent plasma. We'll need a decoy. Kenji's hands shot to his console, his training taking over. Ready, sir. On my mark, Griggs said, his eyes darting between his sensor screen and the viewport. The patrol ships, smaller and faster than the harvesters, moved in a complex, interlocking pattern. There were no gaps. Thorn, Griggs said, his voice dangerously low. Engine status. Capacitor is at 98%. Elias replied without looking up. The viral code is compiled. I'm ready to fire on your command. You'll get one shot, Griggs warned. The moment you power up the emitter, every one of them will know exactly where we are. I only need one. Mark Griggs slammed the thrusters forward. The stiletto leaped from its hiding place. A sudden, violent acceleration that pressed them deep into their seats. Simultaneously, alarms screamed across the Shard Patrol's invisible sensor nets. They had been seen. Vent plasma. Now Griggs yelled. Kenji hit the release. A cloud of superheated plasma erupted from the stiletto's port side. A brilliant, star-like flare. The Shard ships, confused by the sudden appearance of 2 energy signatures, momentarily split their focus. It was the opening Griggs needed. He threw the ship into a gut-wrenching dive, plunging them directly toward the planetary surface, toward the forest of crystalline spires, The shard fighters corrected instantly, swarming after them like angry insects. Crystalline shards, projectiles of pure, focused energy, began to slice through the space around them. One clipped the stiletto's aft section, and the ship screamed in protest. "Hull breach on Deck 3, Kenji yelled over the screech of tearing metal. "It's a cargo hold. Non-critical." They're locking on, Griggs grunted, wrestling with the controls. The small ship bucked and shuddered as he weaved it through the lethal geometry of the enemy's fire. "Thorn, I'm giving you a 10-second window. That's all you get. I'll line up the shot. You take it." The target's spire loomed in the viewport, growing at an alarming rate. It was a beautiful, terrible thing. A flawless crystal that sang with the power of a dying star. Elias's hands were steady on the firing console. All the years of grief, of listening to the ghosts, of nursing his cold, hard hatred, it had all led to this single, perfect moment of release. He could feel his daughter's presence, not as a memory, but as a silent, encouraging weight beside him. This was for her. This was for all of them. 5 seconds, Griggs yelled, his face a mask of concentration. The ship's alarms were a constant, shrieking chorus. "Weapons lock," Kenji confirmed, his voice tight with terror and adrenaline. 4. The spire filled their entire field of view. They were so close they could see the energy arcing across its multifaceted surface. 3. Elias closed his eyes. He didn't need to see it. He could feel it. He could hear its song. He placed his finger on the firing stud. 2. He took a breath, letting all the pain, all the loss, all the rage flow from him, through his hand, into the machine. He saw his daughter's face, laughing in the sunlight of a world that no longer existed. "Fire!" Griggs screamed, pulling the stiletto into a final, impossible roll to give them a clear line of sight. Elias's finger depressed the stud. There was no sound, no explosion. For a single, silent, holy instant, the dissonance engine released its song, a beam of pure conceptual wrongness, invisible to the naked eye but deafening to the soul of the enemy, shot from the ship and struck the target spire. For a moment, nothing happened. The spire continued to glow, the shard fighters continued to close in, and the alarms continued to scream. Kenji's heart sank. It had failed. And then, a single, high-pitched, ringing sound filled the cabin. A sound that wasn't a sound at all, but a pressure inside their skulls. The target spire flickered. Its internal light shifted from a steady blue-white to a chaotic, strobing red. A single, hairline fracture appeared on its surface. Then another, and another. The spire began to vibrate, not with its harmonious hum, but with a violent, uncontrollable shudder. The ringing intensified, and the spire screamed. It was a sound of pure, crystalline agony, a sound that ripped through the hive mind of the shards, a note of perfect, soul-shattering dissonance. The chain reaction had begun. The spire exploded, not in a conventional blast, but in a silent, blossoming flower of razor-sharp fragments. And as it died, it passed the viral song to its neighbors. The spires closest to it began to flicker, to shudder, to scream. The dissonance was spreading, a plague of sound, turning the shard's perfect harmony into a cacophony of self-destruction. The planetary circuit was breaking. The choir was tearing itself apart. The human race had just shouted back into the abyss, and for the first time, the abyss was screaming. The shard hive mind convulsed. The silent, geometric perfection of their swarm broke apart into chaos. Ships that had been moving in flawless, deadly formations faltered. their movements becoming erratic, spasmodic. Some veered off into the void. Others simply tumbled, their internal systems failing as the wave of psychic static washed over them. The planetary hive, their home, their nexus, was broadcasting a symphony of pure agony, and it was scrambling their consciousness. The shard fighters that had been seconds from tearing the stiletto apart suddenly lost their weapons lock. They flew past the human ship, not in a coordinated attack, but in a blind, panicked scatter. Griggs seized the opportunity. He slammed the main thrusters to full, pulling the battered ship out of its dive and rocketing away from the dying planet. "It's working," Kenji whispered, his face pressed against the viewport, his eyes wide with disbelief. "My God, Thorn, it's working." Below them, the planet was a canvas of silent, cascading destruction. The dissonant plague was spreading exponentially, in a wave of red light and shattering crystal radiating out from their initial target. Spires screamed and exploded, each death fueling the next in a feedback loop of sonic horror. The harmonious hum that defined their existence had become a death rattle. The beautiful, terrible music had stopped. "Don't celebrate yet," Griggs grunted, his knuckles white on the controls. "We're not out of this. That blast wave is coming." On the tactical display, a new threat blossomed, a rapidly expanding sphere of energy radiating from the planet. It wasn't a conventional explosion of heat and radiation, but a shock wave of pure spatial distortion. The death throes of the planetary resonance circuit releasing all its stored energy at once. "Thorn, what is that?" Kenji asked, his voice trembling again. Elias was staring at the readings, his expression not of triumph, but of intense, analytical focus. "It's the feedback loop," he said, his voice distant. The engine's song broke their harmony. Now, the collapse of their harmony is creating a new one, a chaotic, untuned chord of pure energy. It's the echo of their death. "Can we outrun it?" Griggs demanded. Elias shook his head slowly. "No. Its propagation speed is near instantaneous. It's not moving through space. It's space itself unraveling." He looked at Griggs, his eyes clear and calm. The fire of vengeance had been replaced by a cold, final clarity. This was always the end of the line. "Griggs, we knew that." Griggs met his gaze, and a silent understanding passed between them. He gave a single, sharp nod. He turned his attention back to his console, not to plot an escape, but to pilot their final moments with the same professionalism he'd shown throughout the mission. He was flying their coffin to its grave, and he would do it perfectly. Kenji, however, was not ready to die. The terror he had held at bay now flooded him completely. "No," he choked out, fumbling with the straps of his harness. "There has to be a way. The engines. If we jettison the engine, reduce our mass, we could." His voice trailed off as he saw the looks on the other two men's faces. He saw no fear, no panic. He saw only acceptance. He was a child in a room full of ghosts, and he was about to become one of them. He slumped back in his chair, a wave of despair washing over him, so profound it was almost peaceful. He thought of his parents back in the quarry, of the life he had dreamed of, the worlds he had wanted to see. It all felt like a story someone else had lived. His entire existence had been a prelude to this single, silent moment at the end of all things. The wave of distortion was almost upon them. The stars ahead of them began to warp and bend, their light smearing across the viewport like wet paint. The stiletto's alarms began to shriek, not in response to a specific threat, but to the fundamental laws of physics beginning to fray at the edges. But through the cacophony, Elias heard something else, a new sound. It wasn't the hum of the shards or the scream of his engine. It was a single, pure, melodic note that seemed to cut through the chaos, a whisper in the roaring storm. "What is that?" he murmured, leaning closer to his console. The ship's deep-range sensors, overwhelmed by the energy waves, were flickering, but one of them was picking up a faint, coherent signal from within the expanding chaos. It was structured. It was intentional. It was a voice. "You have broken the vessel," it seemed to say, not in word, but in a sequence of mathematical concepts and raw emotional data that his mind, now so attuned to the enemy's frequency, could somehow interpret. "But you have not silenced the song." Elias's blood ran cold. "It's not over," he whispered, his eyes wide with a new, dawning horror. The hive, it was just a shell. The wave of distortion hit them. The ship screamed as reality twisted around it. The metal of the hull groaned, flowed like liquid, and then solidified again. The lights flickered, died, and then flared back to life in colors that shouldn't exist. Kenji cried out, clutching his head as the non-Euclidean geometry of the moment pressed in on his senses. But they didn't vaporize. They were still there, intact, humbling through a space that no longer made sense. The shard planet, the hive, was gone. In its place was a tear in the fabric of the universe, a wound of shimmering, chaotic light. And from that wound, something was emerging. It was not a ship. It was a being, a creature of pure resonance, its form defined not by matter, but by the standing waves of the energy it exuded. It was vast, star-sized, its shape constantly shifting, a being of living sound and light that had been wearing the planetary hive like a suit of armor. The shards weren't a species. They were a scab, a crystalline shell grown over something infinitely older, infinitely more powerful. They had not killed the enemy. They had merely woken it up. The being's voice now filled the cockpit, no longer a whisper, but a deafening chorus that resonated directly in their minds. "We are the harmony. The silence was our cradle. You have shattered it. You have sung the song of endings. Now you will hear ours." Griggs, his hand still gripping the helm, let out a choked laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated disbelief. "Well, Thorn," he managed, blood trickling from his nose. "You wanted to punch a god. Looks like you got his attention." The entity's attention was a physical force. The stiletto was caught in its gravitational well, a tiny mote of dust circling a star. But it wasn't trying to crush them. It was observing them. Its voice shifted, probing their minds, sifting through their memories, their fears, their motivations. It tasted Elias's grief, a concept so alien to it, so dissonant, that it recoiled for a moment. It felt Kenji's terror, a chaotic but fascinating frequency. It experienced Griggs' weary resignation, a quiet, fading note that was almost harmonious. "You are loud," the harmony broadcasted, its thoughts now clearer, more focused. "Your existence is a cacophony of pain and fear, a brief, chaotic noise in the grand silence. We offered you the purity of that silence. We offered you the peace of unbeing, and you answered with this ugly scream." Its focus narrowed onto Elias. "You, the composer, you have taught us a new note, the note of rage. It is interesting. We will add it to our song." Energy tendrils, made not of matter, but of pure, focused sound, reached out from the central being and touched the drifting wreckage of the shattered hive. The crystalline fragments, the dust of the dead planet, began to move, to swirl, to coalesce. The harmony was not just a being of sound, it was a master of resonance, capable of manipulating matter itself through pure vibration. The wreckage was reforming, not into the spires of the old hive, but into something new. Warships, hundreds of them, their shapes sharper, more aggressive, their crystalline hulls now streaked with the angry red of the dissonant cascade they had absorbed. The Harmony was learning, it was adapting, it was taking humanity's hate and forging it into new, better weapons. It's using the engine's frequency, Kenji gasped, pointing at his console, which was somehow still functioning. It's integrating the dissonance. It's not a weakness for them anymore. It's a tool. They had not given the enemy a poison. They had given it an upgrade. They had taken a slow, methodical cancer and, in their hubris, had taught it how to metastasize with violent, burning rage. Elias Thorne, the man who had set out to avenge the ghosts of humanity, had just become the architect of its swift and certain doom. He stared at the fleet of new ships, born from the echo of his own hatred, and for the first time in years, he felt something other than grief. He felt a profound, soul-crushing despair. He had failed. He had not only failed to save his daughter's memory, he had desecrated it, turning her loss into the very fuel for the enemy's evolution. His vengeance had been a hollow, selfish thing, and the universe was now going to burn because of it. The Harmony's voice returned, its tone no longer curious but declarative, final. Your song is over. Ours is about to begin. We will carry your rage to every corner of the black. A new instrument in our choir. Your species will be the first to hear it. The first to be unmade by the very echo of your own. Pathetic fury. But you three, you will not have the peace of silence. You will have a front row seat, a tractor beam, a column of pure, solidified sound, locked onto the stiletto. It wasn't pulling them in to be destroyed. It was pulling them in to be displayed. They were a trophy. The first instruments in a new and terrible orchestra. As the small wedge broken ship was drawn inexorably toward the heart of the god of sound, Elias looked away from the monstrous being and at his own reflection in the dark glass of the console. He saw the face of a man who had stared into the abyss and had not just seen it stare back, but had heard it take his name, thank him for the lesson, and promise to teach it to everyone he had ever loved. The silence he had sought to create was a fool's dream. There was no silence. There was only the music, and it was about to get so much louder. The belly of the beast was not a place, but a state of being. The stiletto was suspended in a cathedral of pure light and sound. Its battered hull held motionless in the heart of the Harmony. There were no walls, only an endless, shimmering expanse of geometric patterns that shifted in time with a music that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. The entity was not holding them physically, it was holding their reality, wrapping them in a bubble of its own consciousness. Inside the cockpit, the air was still, the alarm silent. The universe outside their viewport was gone, replaced by the internal landscape of a god's mind. They were a specimen in a jar, a thought experiment for a being that had not encountered a new idea in millennia. The Harmony's voice was a constant presence, a wash of inquiry that sifted through their minds, tasting their memories, analyzing their emotions. It was not violent. It was infinitely curious, the way a scientist might study a virus under a microscope. It felt Elias's grief, turning the concept over and over, fascinated by its sharp, painful edges. It examined Kenji's fear, not as a weakness, but as a complex survival algorithm. It listened to Grig's weariness, a strange, quiet chord of entropy that it found almost peaceful. "It's lonely," Elias whispered, the words sounding alien and loud in the silent cockpit. Griggs and Kenji turned to look at him. The despair in Elias's eyes had been replaced by a terrifying, lucid calm. Don't you feel it, all this harmony? It's one voice, one thought, echoing in a chamber of its own making for eons. It has no concept of other. We're the first real conversation it's ever had. Kenji's mind, the engineer's mind, began to whir, seeing the shape of Elias's thought. A single closed system. He breathed, his terror giving way to a spark of scientific awe. It's perfectly balanced, perfectly stable. Our dissonance, our rage, it was a foreign element. It didn't break the system, it just forced the system to expand to include it. Griggs stared out at the shifting light, a dark, final understanding dawning on his face. So, we didn't just give it a weapon, we gave it company. We taught a god how to be angry. Great. What's next? We teach it how to file taxes. His gallows humor was a thin shield, but it was all they had left. Elias, however, was no longer looking at their defeat. He was looking at the nature of their cage. He had spent years listening to the fragmented souls of the dead. Now, he was inside the largest, oldest, most singular soul in existence, and he saw its weakness, its terrible, absolute solitude. It thinks we gave it one new note, Elias said, his voice gaining strength, but it doesn't understand what it's truly dealing with. It thinks humanity is a single, unified concept. It doesn't understand the chaos. It doesn't understand I. He turned to his crew, his eyes locking onto theirs with an intensity that pulled them in, forging them into a single, desperate will. We have one last thing to fire, one last song to sing. Kenji shook his head. The engine is a wreck. The capacitor is drained. We have nothing left. We have ourselves. Elias countered. The engine was just a megaphone. The real weapon was always the message. The harmony is studying us, trying to integrate our concepts. We're going to give it a dose of the raw, unfiltered source code. All of it. The plan that unfolded was the final, most insane act in a mission defined by insanity. They would use the last dregs of the reactor's power not to fire a weapon, but to overload the dissonance engine's containment field, turning it into a crude, short-range transmitter. But they wouldn't transmit a frequency. They would rig the ship's biomonitors and neural scanner systems designed to keep them alive and reverse the flow. They would broadcast their own living consciousnesses directly into the mind of the god that held them. They would not just knock on the door. They would kick it down and drag the entire, messy, contradictory history of human thought in with them. It will kill us, Kenji stated, not with fear, but with a quiet certainty. It won't just kill us, Elias corrected. It will unmake us. Our minds, our memories, our very sense of self will be poured into it. We will be digested. Griggs looked from Elias to Kenji, and a slow, weary smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a man who had been tired for a very long time and had finally seen a worthy place to rest. So, we go out like humans, he said, loud, angry, and impossible to ignore. I can live with that. He turned to the helm. I'll keep us steady. Point me at its heart. Kenji. The boy who had been so terrified found a strange calm settling over him. He was an engineer. He had a final, elegant, impossible problem to solve. He turned to his console, his hands moving with a newfound purpose. I can create the feedback loop. I can turn our life support into a weapon. It's a beautiful design. That left Elias. He returned to his own station, the Ghost Hunter's station. He opened the databanks where he stored the fragmented cries of the dead colonies. Callisto, Europa Prime, Kepler 186 Sif. A dozen worlds, thousands of voices, all the digital ghosts he had collected. He would be the conduit, not just for the three of them, but for all of them. His final act would not be one of vengeance, but of release. He would give the ghosts their voice, and the universe would listen. Ready, Griggs said, his hand steady on the useless controls. The ship was aimed at the brightest point of light in the endless expanse, the conceptual core of the harmony. Ready, Kenji confirmed, his finger hovering over the sequence that would begin the end. Elias took a breath. He didn't think of the shards or the war. He thought of his daughter on her 5th birthday, her face smeared with cake, her laughter a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. The single, perfect, individual moment that defined everything. That was the note he would add to the choir. Now, Elias said. Kenji hit the switch. The ship screamed, not with tearing metal, but with a sound that was not a sound. As every system overloaded, the lights in the cockpit didn't just go out. They were consumed by a wave of pure white static. The three men were thrown back in their seats, not by a physical force, but by the violent exodus of their own souls. A torrent of pure, raw humanity flooded out of the stiletto and into the serene consciousness of the harmony. It was not a single sword, dissonant note like before. It was a billion notes all at once. It was Kenji's first kiss and his terror in the dark. It was Griggs's love for a family lost to the cold equations of space and his profound weariness with the fight. It was Elias's all-consuming grief for his daughter, but it was also the memory of her life. Every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every single irreplaceable moment. And behind them came the ghosts. The last thoughts of 50,000 colonists on Callisto. The final, desperate love letters from Europa Prime. The children's songs and grocery lists and declarations of war and philosophical treatises. It was the sum of human experience, the nobility and the savagery, the genius and the folly, the love that built worlds and the hatred that tore them down, all dumped into the pristine, orderly mind of a being that had only ever known the sound of one. The harmony recoiled. The perfect light of its consciousness fractured. The single majestic we was shattered by the deafening, chaotic chorus of I. It experienced mortality for the first time. It felt heartbreak. It understood the illogical, beautiful, terrible concept of sacrificing oneself for another. It was an informational plague, a virus of individuality that spread through its consciousness, breaking it apart. The god of sound did not know how to handle the noise. On the bridge of the quarry, weeks later, a deep-range listening post picked up a signal from the Hades system. It was not the silent hum of the shards, nor the triumphant signal of the stiletto. It was a strange, garbled, and deeply complex broadcast. It was the sound of 1,000 new alien fleets, the fractured pieces of the harmony, some still full of rage, others broadcasting tones of pure confusion. Some were fighting each other, some were fleeing into the deep black, some simply floated, silent. If contemplating a new and troubling thought, the monolithic threat was gone, replaced by a universe that was suddenly, terrifyingly, more complicated. The war was not over, but it was a war they could now fight. Humanity was no longer facing a god. It was facing a reflection of its own, chaotic, fractured self, scattered across the stars. The silence of space had been broken for good in the heart of that new, noisy cosmos. The stiletto drifted, a dead and silent ship, Its crew was gone, their consciousness a permanent, echoing scar on the soul of a god. They had not won. They had not lost. They had simply made their point. And across the galaxy, for the first time, something new was listening.